Hello, Year 8. This time, I, Ms. Da, will be giving you an online lesson in science, and our topic today is reproduction in flowering plants. We can all agree that plants are nice to see and nice to smell, and maybe even nice to hold. But flowers are actually the reproductive structure of a plant. And to reproduce, flowers first need to pollinate and then they need to fertilize. And this gives us other flowers, it gives us other fruits, and it gives us other trees. We'll start with pollination first. So there's actually two types of flowers. Flowers that open up in a circle. They have their petals very widely spread and it's a very open flower. And then we have flowers that look more tubular in shape. For example, this hummingbird is actually putting its beak into a very tubular flower, right? So it kind of looks like a cylinder. Let's break down first what a flower is. I'm going to zoom in here. So a flower is actually made of these beautiful petals, right? But before it became a flower, it was actually something that kind of looked like this, which was a little bud. And this bud contained a stalk and it contains these sepals. And these sepals were arranged in this cone-like manner where they were actually protecting the flower that is inside. And after the flower bloomed, it gave us these beautiful petals. So these sepals, because they came before the flower, they actually have a ring here. This is the sepal, and it has a ring here. And this ring is called a calyx. Once it blooms and it gives us these beautiful petals, these petals also have a ring here. And the ring of the petals is called a corolla. Right? From this corolla, we have these branching structures that you can see in yellow and I'm highlighting in blue. This structure is actually the male reproductive part of the flower, the males. Okay? And they're made up of the filament and the anther. And together, they're called the stamen. It's important to note that the anther, although it kind of looks like the filament and a bud just like this, but it actually has a lot of pollen on it. Okay? The anther is what releases the pollen. Apart from the male reproductive organ, we have the female reproductive organ, which is made of the ovary that has a lot of ovules inside it. It also has a style that connects it to a stigma. And this stigma can be hairy and it can be sticky. All right? And the reason that it's hairy or sticky, it's to catch the pollen that's coming to it and to not let go, right? Because we know that flowers get a lot of wind, they get a lot of other insects that come into the flower. So to catch it, it has to be like either hairy or sticky. And together, the stigma, the style, and the ovary are called the carpel, which is the female reproductive organ of the flower. All right, now we're going to see an example of this pollen that's coming to the flower. And although it comes and it catches pollen, it also releases another pollen, all right, from its own anthers and stigma. So pollination actually occurs. Pollination actually occurs when a pollen is transferred from an anther to a stigma. But how do we transfer the anther to the stigma? We can transfer it in one of two ways, all right? You have insects and you have wind. All right, we'll start off with insect pollination. Insect pollination, just like this bee here, and you can see the pollen that's attached to the bee, is when the bee comes to the flower, it visits the flower, and as it's going into the flower, the bee is gonna brush up. So you have like a little bee here. And as it's going into the flower, it's gonna pass by the anther. And passing by the anther is what's gonna cause it to kind of look like this. It's gonna catch all the little pollen from the anther. So how do flowers attract those bees? Flowers have very bright colors. They have a smell. Now the smell can be good and it can be bad. It doesn't always have to be a good smell because good smell attract insects like bees. It can even attract birds. But bat smells can also attract different types of insects, like it can attract bats or it can attract flies, anything that comes and collects the pollen, right? So why do we want these animals to come? We want the animals to come because we want them to try to get to the nectar, because the nectar is actually produced by the flower and it's produced deeper into these areas. All right, and this is food for these little insects. So because you have an insect that's coming into the flower and eating from the flowers that are pollinated using insects actually produce less pollen, because whatever insect that's going to come to it, it's going to catch the pollen from the anther. And because it produces less pollen and you have the insect that's coming into the flower, the stigma, it's going to be on a short style. Because if you have a flower here, all right, and you have a very long female reproductive organ and your stigma is all the way on the outside, when the bee comes, it's going to go directly to the nectar without passing through the stigma. That's why your stigma is going to be a little bit shorter. So when the bee comes in, it can actually brush through the stigma. All right, and it's going to have its anther inside the flower. So the anther is going to get in the way of the bee. You want everything to be in the way of the bee, so that the bee actually brushes through it. All right. A different type of pollination is wind pollination. And as you can see here, all you need is a little wind for your anthers and your pollen to release, and you have a spread of your pollen. So they don't necessarily have to be colorful. They're smaller flowers and they are lightweight. All right, the pollen is usually lightweight, or it would have these little fluffs so that if there is wind, there can be some resistance here and it carries it forward. But because of that, it will have more pollen production, because you don't have a specific insect that's going from one flower to another. You're just haphazardly using the wind to spread it in any direction. You're going to cater to that. You're going to fall safe it by producing more pollen. And it's going to have a feathery stigma. Our stigma in the insect pollinated flower was a bit sticky, or it was a bit hairy, but this is going to be feathery. It's going to be kind of like this structure. All right, because if you have little pollen, or even like fluffy little pollen, like if you have fluffy pollen that's in the air, you want it to be caught by the stigma. All right, and the reason that it's feathery is because it's going to have a larger surface area. All right, so we have pollen and we have a stigma on every flower. How do we avoid self-pollination of the flower? Why doesn't the flower just pollinate itself? Why does it need wind, and why does it need insects? If you pay close attention here, I'll explain why. You can have, like, this is your stigma, this is your style, and this is your ovary. Then you have your filament and you have your anther here. Right? You can have an insect that comes and takes pollen and directly puts it on this stigma here. So this will be noted as self-pollination. But you would have an insect that comes to this plant and takes pollen from here and then goes to another flower and puts it here. This is called cross-pollination. All right, so how do plants avoid self-pollination? Plants can do this in one of two ways. Either they release pollen before the stigma of the same plant is ready to receive pollen, or you have stigmas ready to receive pollen because its own anthers are ready to release its own pollen. Okay? All right, so that's pretty much it about pollination and cross-pollination. We're going to move on to fertilization. So what happens when we have a pollen that have successfully landed on our stigma here? the pollen is going to make a pollen tube, and it's going to travel all the way down. The pollen nucleus is the one that's going to travel to the ovule inside our ovary, right? So this is our ovary and this is our ovary wall. And the pollen tube is made by the pollen grain that is attached. It's not actually there. So if you have more pollens and you have like a lot of ovules that are inside here, then they would make their own path down as well. When it reaches to the ovule, it's going to go in through a micropyle, which is a small opening that the pollen can use to penetrate the ovule. After that, you would have the ovule, and the ovule is going to divide into many cells inside it. This division will later make a food store. But the food store here, as the food store is happening, as it's dividing and getting bigger and bigger and gaining more energy from the photosynthesis that's happening, there's going to be other changes that are on the outside, which is the falling of all the petals and the changing of shape, right? It's going to change shape. If you see this picture here, you have a flower. This is a tomato flower. The seeds actually stay and become the seeds because as all of this is changing, the outer part of the ovule is going to gain a tough coat and the ovule becomes a seed. All right, but the ovary wall changes to become the fruit, and as it grows and it grows, the ovary wall gets bigger and bigger, and it makes you the bigger fruit. All right, the petals are gonna fall down. Sometimes the sepals fall, sometimes they don't, and the stalk or the peduncle, you can sometimes see it in your apples or the oranges that you buy, or even the tomatoes that you buy. So if we fertilized it and made it into a fruit, how do we stop it from overcrowding? Let's say you have a tree with a lot of apples on it, and these apples are falling on the floor. These apples are eventually going to decay, right? And you're going to have a lot of trees that are sprouting here from beneath and near the apple tree. So that's going to be a crowded space, right? And if it's crowded, these plants are going to be fighting for water, they're going to be fighting for the soil, and they're going to be fighting for the sunlight. So what they devised is seed dispersion. So how does seed dispersion happen? Plants can either be eaten by birds, and then the seeds actually survive. And as the bird defecates, the seed will be here. And it will be surviving because the digestive system of the birds can actually hurt the plant. All right, that can't hurt the seed. So wherever it lands, it's going to grow into a big tree. Or it can attach itself to animals. For example, the sheep doesn't know that all of these are actually attached to it. As it grazes somewhere, and let's say it goes to this thick brush here, it's going to rub itself on one of the trees, or it's just going to rub itself against any standing post, and the seeds are going to fall off here, and they're going to sprout trees in this area, right? Or you can have wind pollination again, where the seeds are just blown off somewhere else. Wind pollination can also happen in seeds that kind of look like they have wings. So as the wind pushes onto it, it's gonna spin around and it's gonna fly away. Or you're gonna have it in different types of seeds that actually twist and turn around each other until eventually they pop like a party popper and spread the seeds everywhere. This is all to avoid overcrowding. All right? And that's how we disperse our seeds. I hope you guys understood. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. Bye.